At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe stood at the center of global power. Massive empires dominated the continent, each ruled by monarchs, supported by enormous armies, and driven by ambition. These empires controlled vast territories, influenced global politics, and competed fiercely for prestige, land, and military superiority. Beneath the surface, tensions were building, tensions that would eventually erupt into what the world would remember as World War I. During this period, several powerful empires shaped the political landscape of Europe. Each had its own goals, fears, and rivalries. The balance between these powers was fragile, and even a small spark could ignite a massive conflict. One of the most powerful nations in Europe at the time was the German Empire. Formed in 1871 after the unification of German states, Germany quickly transformed into an industrial and military powerhouse. Its factories produced enormous quantities of steel, weapons, and machinery. The German army was widely considered one of the strongest and most disciplined military forces in the world. Germany's leadership believed the country deserved a greater role on the global stage. However, its rapid rise worried other European nations. Germany was surrounded by potential rivals, and its aggressive military planning created fear across the continent. Meanwhile, another empire dominated the seas, the British Empire. Often described as the largest empire in history, Britain controlled territories across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific. At its peak, the empire ruled over nearly a quarter of the world's population. Britain's greatest strength was its navy. The Royal Navy ensured control of global trade routes and protected British colonies around the world. Because of this naval dominance, Britain closely monitored the rise of other powerful nations, especially Germany, whose growing navy threatened British superiority. To the east stood the massive Russian Empire. In terms of land area, Russia was the largest empire in the world. Its territory stretched across Eastern Europe and deep into Asia. Russia possessed an enormous population and a huge army, which made it a formidable military force. However, Russia faced serious internal problems. Many of its citizens lived in poverty, political unrest was growing, and the government struggled to modernize its economy. Despite these issues, Russia aimed to expand its influence in the Balkans and protect Slavic nations such as Serbia. Another important empire in Europe was Austro-Hungary. Unlike other empires, Austro-Hungary was made up of many different ethnic groups and nationalities. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and others all lived within the empire's borders. This diversity created tension. Many groups wanted independence or greater political power. As a result, the empire faced constant internal pressure. Despite these challenges, Austro-Hungary remained an influential power in Central Europe and played a major role in the events that eventually triggered global war. Further south, the once powerful Ottoman Empire struggled to maintain its influence. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had controlled vast territories across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe. But by the early 20th century, it was in decline. Many regions had already gained independence, and the empire faced growing pressure from European powers. Because of its weakening condition, it was sometimes called the sick man of Europe. Nevertheless, its strategic location between Europe and Asia made it extremely important in global politics. While Europe was dominated by these powerful empires, another rising nation watched events from across the Atlantic, the United States. At the beginning of the 1900s, the United States had become a rapidly growing economic power. Its industries were expanding, its cities were booming, and its influence in global trade was increasing. However, unlike the European empires, the United States generally avoided direct involvement in European conflicts. Many Americans believed their nation should stay neutral and focus on domestic development rather than foreign wars. This policy of relative isolation would later play an important role when war finally broke out in Europe. Despite this distance, the United States closely observed the growing tensions among European powers. American leaders understood that if a major war erupted, its consequences could eventually affect the entire world, including the United States itself. Across Europe, alliances were forming between these powerful nations. Countries began signing military agreements designed to protect themselves in case of war. These alliances created two major blocks of power, which meant that a conflict between two countries could quickly pull many others into battle. At the same time, military competition intensified. Nations expanded their armies, built more advanced weapons, and prepared for potential conflict. War planning became increasingly detailed. Governments believed that if war came, victory would depend on speed, preparation, and overwhelming force. National pride also played a powerful role. Citizens across Europe believed their countries were superior and destined for greatness. Newspapers, speeches, and political propaganda often glorified military strength and patriotic duty. But beneath the pride and ambition lay fear. Fear of losing power, fear of being surrounded by enemies, and fear of falling behind rival nations. By the early 1900s, Europe had become like a tightly wound spring. Every empire was watching the others, building armies, forming alliances, and preparing for a conflict that many believed was inevitable. All it would take was a single event, a spark strong enough to ignite the tensions that had been building for years. And soon, in the city of Sarajevo, that spark would appear. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand would shock the world and trigger a chain reaction that would pull empires, nations, and millions of soldiers into the largest war humanity had ever seen. But before that moment arrived, the stage had already been set. The great empires of Europe stood ready, powerful, proud, and dangerously close to war. When Austro-Hungary declared war on Serbia in July 1914, few people realized how quickly the conflict would spread across Europe. What began as a regional dispute soon transformed into a massive international war involving some of the world's most powerful nations. The key reason for this rapid escalation was the complex system of alliances that had formed across Europe. These alliances were designed to provide protection. If one nation was attacked, its allies would come to its defense. But in reality, these agreements turned a small conflict into a chain reaction of war declarations. After Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, Serbia immediately received support from its powerful ally, the Russian Empire. Russia considered itself the protector of Slavic nations in Eastern Europe and could not allow Serbia to face Austria-Hungary alone. In response, Russia began mobilizing its massive army. Military mobilization was not a small action. It meant preparing millions of soldiers for war, transporting weapons, and moving troops toward borders. To Germany, Russia's mobilization was a direct threat. Germany had long feared fighting a war on two fronts, against Russia in the east and France in the west. To prevent this situation, German military leaders had already developed a detailed strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan. This plan aimed to defeat France quickly before turning full attention toward Russia. As a result, when Russia began mobilizing its army, Germany responded immediately. On August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, Germany also declared war on France. To carry out the Schlieffen Plan, Germany needed to quickly move troops into France. However, the most direct route required passing through the neutral country of Belgium. Belgium had declared neutrality, but Germany decided to invade anyway. German troops crossed the Belgian border in early August 1914. This action shocked Europe. Belgium's neutrality had been guaranteed by several nations, including the United Kingdom. When Germany invaded Belgium, Britain considered it a violation of international agreements. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Within just 1 week, most of Europe had been pulled into conflict. 2 major alliances had formed. On one side were the Central Powers, including Germany and Austro-Hungary. On the other side were the Allied Powers, including Britain, France, and Russia. The war that followed was unlike any previous conflict in human history. Millions of soldiers marched to the front lines, believing the war would end quickly. Many thought it would last only a few months. They were terribly wrong. As armies collided across Europe, new forms of warfare emerged. Machine guns, heavy artillery, and barbed wire made traditional battlefield tactics deadly and ineffective. Soon, soldiers on both sides began digging long defensive trenches across the battlefield. These trenches stretched for hundreds of miles across Western Europe. The war had entered a brutal new phase known as trench warfare. Instead of fast victories, the war turned into a long and exhausting struggle. Battles lasted for months, sometimes years. Entire villages were destroyed. Millions of soldiers were killed or wounded. Meanwhile, nations across the world began choosing sides. Although the United States initially remained neutral, the global scale of the war meant that its consequences would eventually reach far beyond Europe. Trade routes were disrupted, economies were affected, political tensions spread across continents. What had started as a single assassination in Sarajevo had now become a worldwide catastrophe, and as the war continued, it would grow even more destructive. The world had entered the era of modern warfare, and the conflict known as World War I had only just begun.